Her hand is still curled 7,000 years later, as if she had just set something down. She was buried in a rock shelter in what is now one of the driest, hottest, most lifeless places on Earth. No river runs near her grave today, no lake, no green in any direction for hundreds of miles. And yet when researchers finally opened her burial and looked closely at what remained of her body, they found something the desert should never have allowed to survive. Skin, ligament, tissue that had not simply crumbled to dust. The heat that killed almost everything around her had, by strange accident, helped preserve her. For 2 decades, she and the woman buried near her kept a secret that no one could read. Scientists had long known that the Sahara was not always a desert. They had known for the sand under their boots, that lakes once spread across this ground, that rivers once cut channels through rock that is now bone dry, that hippos and giant catfish and antelope once lived, where camels now struggle to survive. What they did not know was who the people were who lived alongside all of that water, who stood on these shorelines, who raised children here, who buried their dead expecting, perhaps, that the green world around them would last. The world's harshest desert was not always harsh. For thousands of years, it was something closer to a garden. And for a long time, the people who once called that garden home were almost completely unknown. Their bones existed, their graves existed, but their DNA, the one kind of evidence that could tell researchers exactly who they were, where they came from, and who their closest relatives might be, refused to survive. Heat destroys genetic material. It breaks the long chains of DNA into pieces too small and too damaged to read. For years, every attempt to recover usable genetic information from Saharan remains had failed. Then 2 women changed that. Their names were never recorded. No inscription marks their graves. But their bodies, preserved by a rare and unlikely combination of dryness, shelter, and undisturbed burial conditions, held something no one expected. DNA old enough and intact enough to finally be read. When researchers extracted and sequenced their genomes, the results did not simply confirm what everyone assumed. They overturned it. The assumption had been simple, and it had held for decades. When the Sahara turned green, it should have become a bridge, a corridor, a place where people from the vast populations south of the desert and the equally vast populations north of it could move freely, mix, trade, and share ancestry, the way water allows movement where sand once blocked it. Grasslands and lakes should have opened the door between 2 great halves of a continent. The 2 women said otherwise. Their genetic ancestry did not match the sweeping migration story anyone expected. It did not closely resemble the populations living south of the Sahara. It did not closely resemble the populations that later spread out of Africa into the wider world. Instead, it revealed something that had never been documented before, a distinct, long-isolated North African lineage, unlike any population identified until now. A people who appeared to have lived largely apart from others for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, even while the world changed dramatically around them. The Green Sahara, it turned out, was not the highway historians had assumed. For the population these 2 women belonged to, it looked more like a homeland, a place where, generation after generation, a distinct human group persisted with only the faintest genetic evidence of contact with outsiders, even as farming, herding, and entirely new ways of living reached them from other directions. How does a human population remain that separate for that long, in the middle of a continent, during the very period when the landscape was at its most open and inviting? How do people accept new tools, new animals, new ways of surviving, and yet remain genetically distinct from the neighbors who might have brought those things? And how did 2 women, buried without inscriptions, without monuments, without any way of announcing who they were, end up rewriting a chapter of North African history that professional researchers had confidently assumed they already understood. This is the story of the Sahara before it became a desert. It is the story of the water that filled it, the animals that thrived in it, and the small human communities who built ordinary lives on its shores, raised children, buried their dead with evident care, and, without knowing it, left behind the only surviving genetic proof of who they really were. It begins not with a discovery, but with two graves that almost gave up nothing at all. If your own family carries stories of a homeland, a place your relatives stayed rooted to for generations, even while the world around them changed, you already understand something about the people this story is about. What is the oldest place your family can trace itself back to, and do you know how long they stayed there before anything changed? To understand what these two women revealed, we first need to understand the world they were born into, because the Sahara those women knew looked almost nothing like the Sahara we know today. Chapter 1. A desert that was once. A lake stand today at the site called Takarkori, in the far southwest of Libya, and the land offers very little. Dry mountains rise out of an ocean of sand. The air holds almost no moisture. Daytime heat can be lethal within hours to anyone without water and shelter. This is the Sahara most people picture, the largest hot desert on Earth, a place defined by its emptiness. But the ground itself remembers something different. Underneath that sand, and etched into the rock walls of shelters, scattered through the Takarkori mountains, is physical proof that this same region once held lakes, rivers, marshes, and grassland, stretching for enormous distances. Scientists call this period the African Humid Period. It is not a guess or a poetic description. It is a well-documented climate event, supported by layers of sediment, ancient pollen, and the remains of animals that could only have lived near water. The African Humid Period did not happen once, briefly, by accident. It lasted, in its most recent form, from roughly 14,500 years ago to about 5,000 years ago. For close to 10,000 years, shifts in the Earth's orbit changed how sunlight fell across North Africa, altering monsoon patterns and pulling moisture deep into a region that is bone dry today. Rain that today almost never reaches this far north fell here regularly. Lakes formed in basins that are now nothing but dust. Seasonal rivers carried water across distances that would be unthinkable now. The proof is not limited to soil samples in a laboratory. It is carved directly into the rock walls above where people once lived. Across the Takarkori and neighbouring mountain ranges, ancient artists left behind thousands of images. Cattle, painted with careful attention to their horns and hides. Giraffes, moving in long-necked processions across the stone. Elephants, crocodiles, hippopotamuses, an animal that requires permanent, substantial bodies of water to survive at all. There are images that researchers interpret as human swimmers, arms and legs extended in the unmistakable posture of people moving through water rather than walking across land. A hippopotamus cannot exist in a desert, neither can a crocodile. Their presence in this rock art is not a metaphor or an artistic flourish. It is a direct, physical claim about the environment the artists were living in, a claim that has since been confirmed by bones. Excavations at Takarkori and nearby sites have recovered actual animal remains that match what the rock art shows. Fish bones in large numbers, turtle shell fragments, and the skeletal remains of animals that depend on year-round water sources. At the center of this transformed landscape sat the rock shelter that would eventually give up its two most important secrets. Takarkori sits at the base of a mountain wall, offering natural shade and protection from wind and sun. Below it, during the humid period, spread a landscape almost unrecognizable compared to today. Shallow lakes, seasonal marshland, grasses supporting herds of wild game, and enough standing water to sustain fish populations large enough to matter as a food source. People had almost certainly moved through this region long before any lake formed there. But it was the arrival of consistent water that allowed something new, not just visits, but settlement. Excavations show that people began occupying Takarkori in a sustained way, starting around 10,200 years ago, during what archaeologists label the late Akakus period. These earliest residents were not farmers and not yet herders. They were hunter-gatherer fishers, people who built their lives around the resources the landscape offered directly. Fish pulled from nearby waters, wild plants gathered in season, and animals hunted across the surrounding grassland. The evidence for how seriously they took this settled life is more substantial than a scattering of bones. Archaeologists have identified stone structures at the site, the remains of huts, windbreaks, and platforms, along with large hearths used repeatedly over time, and grinding stones worn smooth from processing plant foods. This was not a population passing through once and never returning. This was a community returning to the same sheltered space, season after season, building physical structures meant to last, and leaving behind evidence of daily domestic life, cooking, food preparation, shelter building, and presumably the raising of children within sight of the mountain wall that sheltered them. This is the world into which the story's two central figures were eventually born, though not at the very beginning of the settlement's long history. By the time these two women lived, the shelter had already been inhabited, off and on, for thousands of years. Generations had come before them, generations of people who fished the same waters, gathered the same plants, and were, as later evidence would show, remarkably consistent in who they were, genetically, across an extraordinary span of time. Picture, for a moment, what daily life at the base of that mountain wall might genuinely have looked like during the wetter centuries of this settlement's history, grounded strictly in what the physical evidence supports. Mornings would likely have begun near the shore of a shallow lake or marsh, the surface disturbed by wading birds, and, based on the rock art evidence, occasionally by the enormous bulk of a hippopotamus moving through the shallows. Fishing would have required skill and patience, working nets or simple tools to bring in the fish whose bones now fill the excavated layers of the site in such substantial quantity. Grasslands stretching away from the water's edge would have supported herds of wild game long before any domesticated animal arrived, and later, cattle brought into the community through contact with outside groups. The rock shelter itself, its overhang casting reliable shade against a sun that even during the humid period would have remained intense, offered a natural gathering place, somewhere to process food, tend fires whose remains still mark the site today, and, eventually, bury the community's dead. None of this reconstruction claims more precision than the evidence allows. No researcher can say with certainty what a specific morning looked like, what conversations passed between specific individuals, or what any single person felt as they went about their day. But the physical remains recovered from Takarkori, considered together, do support this general picture of a functioning, resource-rich settlement, anchored to water, shaped by fishing and eventually herding, and sustained across an extraordinary length of time by a landscape that offered, for thousands of years, genuine and reliable abundance. It would be easy to imagine the Green Sahara as simply an earlier, wetter version of the world beyond it, connected easily to the Nile Valley to the east, to the vast populations of West Africa to the south, to the Mediterranean coast to the north. A green landscape, after all, invites movement in a way a lethal desert does not. Water in the middle of a continent should function like a bridge, drawing people from every direction toward it and allowing them to pass through toward each other. That assumption shaped how researchers interpreted this region for a very long time. It made intuitive sense. It fit with everything known about how human populations generally behave when a barrier disappears. And for decades, without a way to directly test that assumption using genetic evidence, it stood largely unchallenged. The problem was evidence. Not a shortage of graves. Archaeologists had located dozens of burials across Saharan sites over the decades, including 15 burials of women and children found deep inside the Takarkori rock shelter itself, dating across a period from roughly 8,900 to 4,800 years ago. The problem was recovering anything from those burials specific enough to answer the question directly. Bones can reveal age, general health, sometimes diet through chemical analysis. They cannot, on their own, reveal ancestry with precision. For that, researchers needed something far more fragile and far harder to preserve: DNA. And DNA, in a place like this, is normally the first thing to disappear. Heat is the enemy of genetic preservation. The long, complex molecules that carry a person's genetic code begin breaking down almost immediately after death, and high, sustained temperatures accelerate that breakdown dramatically. Most successful ancient DNA recoveries in human history have come from cold environments: permafrost, high-altitude caves, deep temperate soil where temperatures stay low and stable for thousands of years. The Sahara offered close to the opposite of ideal conditions. Daytime heat routinely exceeded temperatures that damage or destroy genetic material within a human lifetime, let alone across 7,000 years. For this reason, every previous attempt to extract usable ancient DNA from human remains in the Sahara had failed, or produced results too fragmented and too contaminated with environmental material to trust. The region's deep human history, a history now proven, through rock art and animal bone and sediment, to include a genuinely transformed, green, water-rich landscape, remained, in the one area that mattered most for understanding who actually lived there, essentially silent. The bones of the 15 individuals buried at Takarkori sat in careful excavation storage for years, their genetic secrets apparently locked away permanently by the same heat that had destroyed the landscape around them. Then researchers turned their attention to two specific burials. Two women, both adults, both unusually well preserved compared to the others recovered from the same shelter. Their bodies had not fully decomposed in the way that most human remains do, even in dry conditions. Skin remained. Connective tissue remained. Whatever combination of burial depth, shelter conditions, and sheer chance had protected them, it had done something that seemed, on the surface, almost impossible in this environment. It gave scientists a reason to try again. Chapter 2. The People Who Stayed by the Water. Before any genetic sequence could be read, researchers had to reconstruct, as carefully as they could, the kind of life the Takarkori community actually lived. Every detail mattered: what people ate, what they built, what animals surrounded them, and how their relationship with those animals changed over time. All of it would eventually matter for understanding two isolated skeletons pulled from 15 graves. But long before anyone thought about ancient DNA, this was simply the work of understanding a vanished society through what it physically left behind. The earliest residents of Takarkori, the late Akakos hunter-gatherer fishers, built a life organized closely around water. Excavated remains show large quantities of fish bone, evidence of sustained and serious fishing rather than occasional opportunistic catches. Alongside the fish came turtle remains and traces of aquatic plants processed and eaten as food. This was not a community surviving at the margins of a difficult landscape. It was a community whose environment offered genuine abundance, at least for a while. Grinding stones recovered from the site, worn smooth through repeated use, point to the regular processing of plant foods, likely wild grains and other gathered vegetation available across the surrounding grassland. Large hearths, built and rebuilt across multiple occupation layers, suggest not brief visits but sustained residence, people returning to the same sheltered space across many seasons, cooking food, presumably raising children, and building a life anchored to this particular stretch of rock and shade. Then, roughly 8,300 years ago, something changed. Evidence at the site marks the beginning of what archaeologists call the pastoral Neolithic, the introduction of domesticated animals into a landscape that had previously supported only wild game. This was not a sudden replacement of one way of life with another. It was a gradual shift, unfolding across centuries, as herding slowly became integrated into a community that had built its identity around fishing and gathering for thousands of years before. The physical evidence of this earliest pastoral period is striking in one specific way. The burials associated with it are overwhelmingly women and children. Archaeologists have noted this pattern directly. Whatever social or practical reason lay behind it, whether tied to specific roles within the community, to the circumstances of who was present at the shelter during this particular span of time, or to burial customs not fully understood, the presence of predominantly women and children among the earliest pastoral period graves at Takarkori is one of the site's most distinctive features. It also foreshadows exactly who, thousands of years later, would end up carrying the genetic evidence that would finally answer questions about this population's origins. A full pastoral economy, one where herded animals became a dependable core of the community's food supply rather than a supplement to fishing and gathering, did not arrive quickly. Evidence suggests it took roughly 1,000 years after the first domesticated animals appeared before herding became a truly central part of daily survival at Takarkori. Cattle exploitation, including the deliberate use of milk rather than only meat, is documented from around 7,100 years ago onward, when the shelter appears to have been occupied more seasonally, likely tracking the rhythm of rainfall and the availability of grazing land. The dairying evidence deserves particular attention because it represents one of the clearest bridges between the rock art on the mountain walls and the physical remains found in the ground. Rock art throughout the Tadrat Akakas region shows domesticated cattle in unmistakable detail, including scenes that appear to depict the act of milking directly. For a long time, this art stood as suggestive but unconfirmed evidence. Rock art is notoriously difficult to date with precision on its own. It can show what people considered important enough to record, but it cannot, by itself, prove exactly when a practice began or how central it truly was to daily life. Chemical analysis solved that problem. Researchers examined lipid residues absorbed into the walls of ancient pottery vessels excavated from Takarkori, along with stable carbon isotope signatures preserved within those residues. The results provided direct chemical evidence of dairy processing dating to the 5th millennium before the Common Era, making this among the earliest confirmed evidence of dairying anywhere in ancient Africa. The rock art had not exaggerated. The cattle on the walls and the milk residues in the pottery told the same story from two entirely different kinds of evidence, arriving at the same conclusion independently. This detail matters for more than just documenting an early food technology. It reveals something about how new ways of living reached the people of Takarkori. Domesticated cattle did not originate in this specific pocket of the Sahara. The animals themselves, and the knowledge of how to herd, breed, and eventually milk them, arrived from elsewhere, carried by the movement of ideas, techniques, and very likely small numbers of people moving across the landscape and encountering the established population already living around Takarkori's lakes and marshes. This raises the central question that would eventually require genetic evidence to answer with any confidence. When new technology, new animals, and new subsistence strategies moved into a region, did the people carrying those innovations also move in and settle permanently, mixing with and gradually replacing the population already there? Or did the ideas and the animals spread largely on their own, passed from group to group through contact, trade, and cultural exchange, while the population itself remained largely the same people it had always been? Archaeology alone struggles to answer this question with certainty. A new tool, a new animal, a new food processing technique can spread through trade and imitation just as easily as through migration and replacement. Bones can show diet and health. They cannot on their own show where the person eating that diet was born, or who their grandparents were, or whether their ancestors had lived in this exact region for 10 generations or one. This is precisely the gap that ancient DNA is uniquely equipped to close. Genetic material carries information that no other kind of archaeological evidence can provide. A direct record of biological ancestry, inherited across generations, largely unaffected by what a person ate, built, or believed. If the population living at Takarkori during the pastoral period had been substantially replaced by newcomers bringing cattle and new technology, their DNA would show it, carrying genetic signatures linking them closely to whatever outside population had arrived. If, instead, the population had remained largely the same people, adopting new tools and animals through contact rather than replacement, their DNA would tell a very different story, one of striking continuity, generation after generation, even as daily life visibly transformed around them. For a very long time, no one could test which of these two very different stories was true. The heat of the Sahara had made sure of that. What researchers did have, by the time genetic analysis became possible, was an increasingly detailed picture of daily life at Takarkori across thousands of years. A community that began as fishers and gatherers on the shore of a shallow lake, a community that slowly adopted herding, without abandoning the fishing and gathering that had sustained earlier generations. A community that processed milk from their cattle, wove baskets and textiles using at least 8 distinct techniques identified in surviving fragments, decorated pottery with careful skill, and used red and yellow pigments, likely sourced locally, in both their pottery finishes and the rock art covering the walls above their homes. And, running through the middle of this long occupation, a burial pattern dominated by women and children, preserved for thousands of years inside a rock shelter that offered just enough protection from the elements to keep their remains from being erased entirely. The material culture recovered from Takarkori deserves a closer look, because it reveals a community with genuine craft sophistication, not a population merely surviving at subsistence level. The basketry recovered from the site is a particularly striking example. Archaeologists studying the surviving fragments have identified as many as 8 distinct weaving techniques represented within the collection, all sharing a twined construction method, in which strands are worked horizontally across a vertical framework. Organic materials like woven fiber almost never survive across thousands of years in most archaeological contexts anywhere in the world. They decompose too readily, especially in the presence of moisture or biological activity. Their survival at Takarkori, in this range and variety, is itself a rare archaeological gift, made possible by the specific, unusually dry and stable conditions within the sheltered rock formation, the same conditions that would later prove essential for preserving the two women's genetic material as well. The pottery tells a similarly detailed story. Vessels recovered from the site show careful attention to finish and decoration, using pigments, chiefly derived from hematite, an iron-rich mineral likely sourced from the local landscape, worked into both the surface treatment of the pottery itself and the rock art covering the shelter's walls above. This shared use of the same local pigment source across two very different kinds of material culture, portable pottery and permanent rock painting, suggests a community with an established, consistent visual and material tradition, one maintained and passed down across generations rather than reinvented sporadically. The pottery's construction and finish have been described by researchers studying comparable Holocene sites across the region as advanced relative to contemporary ceramic traditions elsewhere, a detail that reinforces the picture of Takarkori as a settled, skilled, and culturally established community rather than a marginal or transient population. Evidence of early plant cultivation practices identified through residue found within pottery vessels recovered from the earliest occupation layers at the site adds one further layer of sophistication to this picture. While the community's primary subsistence strategy across most of its long history centered on fishing, gathering, and eventually herding, this evidence suggests at least some experimentation with managing and processing specific plant resources took place far earlier than researchers might otherwise have assumed, hinting at a level of environmental knowledge and active landscape management extending beyond simple foraging. Taken together, the baskets, the pottery, the consistent use of local pigment, and the early evidence of plant processing all point toward the same underlying conclusion supported by the genetic evidence discussed in later chapters. This was not a population passing briefly through a temporarily hospitable landscape, picking up whatever resources happened to be available before moving on. This was a community that invested real time, skill, and multi-generational continuity into developing distinctive craft traditions, tied specifically to this particular place, across a span of time long enough for those traditions to be refined, taught, and passed down repeatedly before the two women whose burials would eventually reveal so much were ever born. Two of those women, in particular, had been protected by something even the rest of the community's dead had not received, a level of preservation rare enough and complete enough that when the technology to read ancient DNA finally caught up with the questions researchers were asking, their bodies might, just might, still hold an answer. Chapter 3. The Problem with Reading Very Old Bones. To understand why two ordinary-looking burials became the center of an international research effort, it helps to understand exactly how difficult ancient DNA recovery actually is, and why the Sahara stood as one of the most stubborn problems in the entire field. Every living cell contains DNA, a long coiled molecule that carries the biological instructions for building and maintaining a body. After death, that molecule does not remain intact. Enzymes within the body's own cells begin breaking it down almost immediately. Bacteria and other microorganisms accelerate the process further. Environmental exposure, moisture, oxygen, sunlight, and above all heat, continues the damage for as long as any trace of the body remains. Over time, what was once a long, continuous strand of genetic code breaks into smaller and smaller fragments. Given enough time and the wrong conditions, those fragments eventually become too short, too damaged, and too mixed with contaminating genetic material from soil bacteria, fungi, and other organisms to reconstruct anything meaningful. This is why successful ancient DNA recovery skews so heavily toward cold environments. Consistently low temperatures dramatically slow the chemical reactions responsible for genetic decay. Some of the most well-preserved ancient genomes in human history have come from remains frozen in permafrost or buried in consistently cool cave sediments for tens of thousands of years. Heat does the opposite. It speeds up every one of these destructive processes. A hot, dry environment like the Sahara might seem, on the surface, like it should preserve remains well, since dryness can slow bacterial decay of soft tissue. And in some ways it does, which is part of why the two Takarkori women retained visible skin and ligament tissue after 7,000 years, an unusual and striking form of preservation. But heat and dryness are not the same as cold. The sustained high temperatures common across the Sahara for most of the year actively damage DNA at the molecular level, regardless of how well the surrounding soft tissue happens to survive. This created a frustrating and, for a long time, seemingly permanent gap in the region's history. Archaeologists could excavate burials. They could study skeletal structure, dental wear, and signs of injury or disease. They could analyze the chemical isotopes locked into bone and teeth to make inferences about diet, and in some cases, general patterns of movement across a person's lifetime. What they could not do with any existing technology was extract DNA specific and intact enough to answer the most direct question of all: who were these people, genetically, and where did their ancestors come from? Every previous attempt to recover ancient human DNA from Saharan remains had failed to produce results reliable enough to publish with confidence. The genetic material that did survive was too fragmented, too degraded, or too heavily contaminated by environmental DNA to distinguish clearly from noise. For researchers studying the Green Sahara, this meant working with an frustrating asymmetry. The environmental evidence for the region's dramatic climate history was, by comparison, abundant and increasingly precise. Sediment cores revealing ancient lake beds, pollen records showing exactly which plants grew and when, animal bones confirming which species lived alongside the human population at different points across thousands of years. But the human population itself, the very people whose lives this environmental data was meant to explain, remained a genetic blank. This is the specific problem that made the Takarkori burials worth revisiting with newer techniques. Advances in ancient DNA extraction methods over the past 2 decades developed largely in response to challenges recovering usable genetic material from difficult, non-ideal environments around the world, gradually improved researchers' ability to recover shorter, more damaged DNA fragments and reconstruct meaningful genetic information from them. Techniques for identifying and filtering out contaminating environmental DNA also improved substantially, allowing researchers to isolate genuine human genetic material from the much larger volume of bacterial and fungal DNA present in almost any ancient sample. Even with these improvements, success was far from guaranteed. Researchers needed remains that offered the best possible starting conditions: minimal exposure to extreme temperature swings, protection from direct sun and rain, and ideally, some unusual combination of circumstances that had slowed genetic decay beyond what the surrounding environment would normally allow. The 2 women buried at Takarkori met that threshold in a way almost none of the site's other burials did. Their preservation was unusual enough that researchers specifically selected them, out of the 15 individuals recovered from the shelter, as the strongest candidates for a renewed attempt at genetic recovery. Bone density, tissue preservation, and burial context all suggested these 2 graves offered the best remaining chance of success anywhere in the region. The women had been buried between roughly 6,800 and 7,200 years ago, placing them firmly within the pastoral period of the site's long occupation, a time when the community had already integrated herding into a life still partly built around fishing and gathering. Their burial context, deep within the rock shelter and apparently undisturbed for millennia, had shielded them from many of the extreme temperature fluctuations affecting more exposed sites across the region. Extracting DNA from bone and tooth samples this old required extraordinary care. Researchers worked in specialized cleanroom laboratories designed to prevent modern human DNA, present essentially everywhere in the environment, from contaminating the ancient samples. Every step, from initial sample collection through chemical extraction and genetic sequencing, carried the risk of introducing contamination that could render an entire analysis meaningless, or, worse, misleading. Despite the difficulty, the effort succeeded. Researchers managed to recover genome-wide data, meaning not just a handful of isolated genetic markers, but hundreds of thousands of distinct points across the genome, sufficient to support detailed ancestry analysis. It marked the first time scientists had successfully sequenced whole or near-whole genomes from human remains recovered from a hot, arid environment on this scale. The achievement was, in itself, a meaningful technical milestone, regardless of what the results eventually showed. But the technical success was only the beginning. Recovering the DNA answered one question: could genetic information survive here at all? It did not yet answer the far larger question that had brought researchers to this specific site in the first place. Once the genetic code was in hand, it needed to be compared against genetic data from populations across Africa and beyond, searching for patterns of shared ancestry, points of genetic overlap, and, just as importantly, points of genetic difference. That comparison would decide which understanding of the Green Sahara was correct. Either the two women's ancestry would closely resemble populations from south of the desert, supporting the long-standing assumption that the region had functioned as an open corridor connecting distant populations during the humid period, or their ancestry would tell a very different story, one that no one studying this region had confidently predicted. The lab work took time. Genome-wide sequencing from degraded ancient samples is not instantaneous, and confirming results requires multiple rounds of verification to rule out contamination, sequencing errors, and statistical artifacts that could produce misleading conclusions. Throughout this process, the two women remained, in a sense, silent. Their bodies had survived 7,000 years. Their genetic code had somehow survived alongside them. But the meaning of that genetic code, what it actually revealed about who they were and where their ancestors had come from, was still locked inside data, waiting to be properly analyzed and compared. The specific numbers behind this genetic recovery are worth walking through in a bit more detail, because they clarify just how narrow the margin of success actually was, and why this particular pair of burials mattered so much. Ancient DNA researchers typically describe the quality of a genetic sample using a measure of endogenous DNA, meaning the proportion of genetic material recovered from a sample that actually belongs to the individual being studied, as opposed to bacterial, fungal, or other environmental DNA that has colonized the remains after death. In cold, well-preserved samples, endogenous DNA content can sometimes reach a substantial proportion of total recovered genetic material, giving researchers ample usable data to work with. In hot, arid environments, endogenous DNA content is typically a tiny fraction of what is recovered, often requiring researchers to sequence enormous quantities of genetic material simply to capture enough authentic human DNA fragments to support meaningful analysis. The Takarkori samples fell squarely into this difficult category. Researchers involved in the project have described the endogenous DNA content recovered from the two women's remains as low, consistent with the generally poor preservation conditions typical of hot desert environments, even accounting for the unusually favorable circumstances of these two specific burials compared to others at the same site. Recovering genome-wide data under these conditions required not just skill, but a substantial amount of laboratory effort, sequencing far more raw genetic material than would be necessary for a comparable sample recovered from a cold environment, in order to isolate enough genuine human DNA fragments to support the kind of detailed ancestry analysis the research ultimately achieved. This context matters because it explains why previous researchers, working with less advanced extraction and sequencing techniques, had been unable to produce reliable results from Saharan human remains, despite years of interest in exactly this question. The technology required to succeed here did not exist, in a practical, cost-effective form, until relatively recently. Techniques for targeting and enriching specific regions of the genome most useful for ancestry analysis. Methods for statistically distinguishing authentic ancient DNA fragments from modern contamination, based on characteristic patterns of chemical damage that accumulate in genetic material over thousands of years, and increasingly powerful computational tools for analyzing degraded, fragmentary genetic data, all needed to mature substantially before a project like this stood a realistic chance of success. The research team involved in this specific study brought together specialists across several distinct fields, reflecting just how many different kinds of expertise this kind of investigation actually requires. Archaeologists who had spent years, in some cases decades, excavating and studying the Takarkori site and its surrounding region contributed the essential contextual knowledge, precisely when and how the burials had been created, what the broader material culture at the site revealed about the community's way of life, and which specific individuals, out of the 15 burials present, offered the best realistic chance of yielding usable genetic material. Geneticists, specializing in ancient DNA extraction and sequencing, contributed the laboratory techniques necessary to actually recover and read whatever genetic material remained. Population geneticists, specializing in statistical methods for comparing ancient genomes against broader reference databases, contributed the analytical tools necessary to interpret what the recovered genetic data actually meant, placing it in context against comparable data from dozens of other ancient and modern populations across Africa, the Near East, and beyond. This kind of multidisciplinary collaboration reflects how contemporary archaeological genetics actually works, and it is worth appreciating directly, because it stands in real contrast to any image of a single scientist working alone in a laboratory, waiting for a discovery to simply appear. The successful recovery and interpretation of the Takarkori genomes required years of prior archaeological work, establishing the site's chronology and context, specialized skill in navigating some of the most technically demanding sample conditions anywhere in the field of ancient DNA research, and sophisticated statistical modeling capable of drawing meaningful conclusions from genetic data that, even after successful recovery, remained more fragmentary and more difficult to interpret with full confidence than comparable data from better preserved sites elsewhere in the world. The result of this combined effort was not just a successful technical achievement, though it was certainly that. It was a direct, evidence-based answer to a question that had remained genuinely open for decades, resolved not through further speculation or more elaborate theoretical reasoning, but through the patient, painstaking recovery and analysis of the one kind of evidence capable of settling the matter directly. Two women, buried according to their community's customs roughly 7,000 years ago, had, without any way of knowing it, preserved within their own bodies the single most direct possible answer to a question their own descendants, and the descendants of every other population living across the Green Sahara during their lifetimes, would spend thousands of subsequent years unable to answer for themselves. When the comparison finally came, the results did not confirm the corridor theory that had shaped assumptions about this region for decades. They overturned it. Chapter 4. A lineage no one had documented. The genetic comparison researchers ran was not a single test with a single yes or no answer. It was a broad analysis, placing the two Takarkori women's genomes alongside genetic data from dozens of other ancient and modern populations across Africa, the Near East, and beyond. searching for patterns of shared ancestry, shared genetic drift, and specific genetic markers known to distinguish one population's history from another's. What emerged was not a confirmation of expected connections. It was the identification of something new. The two women's genomes predominantly carried what researchers describe as a previously undocumented ancestral North African lineage. This phrase deserves unpacking, because it carries more weight than it might first appear to. It does not mean the two women were simply African, a category so broad it explains almost nothing about specific ancestry. It means their genetic ancestry, traced back to a specific, distinct population lineage within the North African region, one that had never before been identified or described in any previously published genetic study, ancient or modern. In practical terms, researchers had expected the two women's ancestry to align closely with one of two established genetic profiles, either populations closely related to those from north of the Sahara near the Mediterranean coast, or populations more closely related to communities from south of the desert in the sub-Saharan region. The data showed neither. Instead, it revealed something structurally distinct from both, a genetic signature belonging to its own separate branch. To understand how significant this is, it helps to think about how population geneticists trace ancestry across deep time. Human populations that remain in genetic contact with one another, exchanging people through migration, marriage, and movement across generations, tend to share overlapping genetic signatures, gradually blending and reflecting that contact in their DNA. Populations that become isolated from one another, cut off by distance, geography, or simply reduced contact over long periods, gradually diverge. Their genetic signatures drift apart, not because anyone intended this to happen, but because isolated populations accumulate their own distinct genetic changes over generations, unshared by groups they are no longer regularly mixing with. The genetic profile carried by the two Takarkori women showed clear signs of this kind of long divergence. Their closest genetic relationships were not with sub-Saharan African populations, despite living during a period when the Sahara was green, watered, and, by every reasonable assumption, far more passable than the desert that exists there today. Instead, their strongest genetic affinities connected them to other ancient North African populations, specifically to remains recovered from sites called Ifri Uberid and Ifri Namra Musa, and to an even older and more striking connection, foragers recovered from Tafaralt Cave in Morocco, dated to approximately 15,000 years ago. This last connection carries enormous weight. 15,000 years separates the earlier Tafaralt foragers from the Takarkori women. That is a span of roughly 600 human generations. And yet the genetic evidence suggests these populations, separated by that much time and by well over 1,000 miles of geography, shared a long-standing, comparatively stable ancestral lineage in North Africa, one that appears to have persisted with relatively limited outside genetic influence across an extraordinary length of time. The implications reach further than simply describing two women's personal ancestry. If their genetic profile reflects a broader regional population rather than an isolated genetic anomaly limited to their own family, it suggests that a distinct North African lineage existed and persisted across the region for tens of thousands of years, remaining largely intact even through dramatic environmental shifts, including the very transformation from desert to grassland and back to desert that defines the Green Sahara period itself. Researchers were able to estimate using established methods for calculating genetic divergence based on the accumulation of small mutations over generations, roughly when this North African lineage separated from other major African population branches. The estimate places this divergence at approximately the same time as the broader migration of early modern human populations out of Africa into the rest of the world, a movement dated to roughly 50,000 years ago. In other words, at approximately the moment when other populations were beginning journeys that would eventually carry human ancestry across Asia, Europe, and beyond, the ancestors of the people who would eventually settle at Takarkori appear to have branched off and remained, largely in place, in North Africa. That is an immense span of time for a population lineage to remain distinguishable from its neighbours. 50,000 years contains room for enormous change. Shifting climates, the rise and fall of countless environments, the arrival and departure of other human populations moving through or near the region, and, within the more recent period covered by this specific evidence, the dramatic transformation of the Sahara itself from arid desert to green, water-rich savanna, and eventually back to desert again. Through all of that environmental upheaval, the genetic evidence suggests this particular lineage persisted with a level of continuity that surprised the researchers studying it. One additional detail from the genetic analysis reinforces just how isolated this population appears to have remained. Human populations that migrated out of Africa tens of thousands of years ago encountered and, in many documented cases, interbred with Neanderthal populations already established across parts of Europe and Asia. As a result, most people today whose ancestry traces primarily outside Africa carry small but measurable amounts of Neanderthal DNA, a lasting genetic signature of that ancient contact. The two Takarkori women carried significantly less Neanderthal ancestry than populations outside Africa typically do. This is not simply a minor technical footnote. It is additional, independent evidence supporting the broader picture. A population that branched off from other human lineages at roughly the same time large-scale migration out of Africa began, but that itself remained within Africa, largely isolated from the specific populations that went on to encounter and mix with Neanderthals elsewhere. There was one meaningful exception to this pattern of isolation. The genetic data did reveal small traces of what researchers describe as Levantine admixture, meaning a limited degree of genetic contact with populations originating from the Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern region. This detail matters because it shows the Takarkori population was not entirely sealed off from all outside contact across their long history. Some genetic exchange did occur, likely reflecting limited movement or contact events from the north or northeast, distinct from any substantial exchange with populations to the south. But this contact appears to have been modest, a trace rather than a defining feature of their overall ancestry, consistent with a population that experienced occasional outside influence while remaining, in its broad genetic character, remarkably continuous and distinct. Taken together, this evidence painted a picture strikingly different from what researchers had expected to find. Rather than confirming the Green Sahara as an open corridor connecting northern and sub-Saharan African populations, during a period when geography should have made that connection easier than at almost any other point in the region's history, the genetic data pointed toward a long isolated, previously unknown North African lineage, persisting in place across tens of thousands of years, largely apart from the very populations the humid period should, in theory, have connected them to. The two women had not simply confirmed an existing understanding of Saharan prehistory. There is a further layer of complexity within this comparison that responsible researchers have taken care not to flatten into an oversimplified story, and it is worth sitting with directly because it changes how the isolation of the Takarkori lineage should be understood. The Tafaralt individuals themselves, the 15,000-year-old foragers from Morocco whose genetic profile most closely resembles that of the two Takarkori women, are not themselves a genetically simple population. Earlier genetic research conducted specifically on the Tafaralt remains, well before the Takarkori genomes existed for comparison, had already revealed that these Ice Age North Africans carried a notably mixed genetic profile of their own, a genetic affinity with early populations from the Near East, alongside a substantial proportion of ancestry, estimated at roughly 1/3 of their total genetic makeup, connecting them to sub-Saharan African populations, best approximated through genetic components still present today among West and East African groups. This detail complicates any simple story of complete, unbroken North African isolation, stretching back 50,000 years without interruption. The Takarkori population, living roughly 15,000 years ago, during the cold, dry conditions of the late Pleistocene, well before the Green Sahara transformed the region, already carried evidence of earlier genetic contact, both with populations to the east, in the direction of the Near East, and with populations to the south, in the direction of sub-Saharan Africa. Isolation, in other words, was not the whole story even for the deep ancestral population that both the Takarkori foragers and the later Takarkori herders descended from. What makes the later Takarkori evidence so significant is not that it reveals a population with zero outside contact across its entire history. It is that it reveals a population that, by the time of the Green Sahara itself, during the very period when environmental conditions should have made renewed contact with sub-Saharan populations easier than at almost any other point in the region's history, shows no meaningful increase in that specific kind of genetic exchange. If anything, the data suggests something close to the opposite. The Takarkori individuals and the earlier Takarkori individuals appear roughly equally distant, genetically, from sub-Saharan African lineages, despite being separated from each other by 8,000 years and by the complete transformation of the intervening landscape from desert to green savanna and partway back again. This is a more precise and in some ways more surprising finding than a simple story of total isolation would have been. It suggests that whatever genetic connections to the Near East and to sub-Saharan Africa had already been established in this North African lineage by around 15,000 years ago, those connections did not meaningfully deepen or expand during the many centuries when the Green Sahara offered its most favorable conditions for exactly that kind of contact. The corridor, however hospitable it may have looked to modern eyes studying the rock art and the lake sediments, simply was not functioning as a significant channel for large-scale genetic exchange between northern and sub-Saharan populations, even at its most passable. The Neanderthal ancestry data adds one further layer of precision to this picture, and it is worth walking through carefully, because the pattern it reveals is more specific than a simple binary of isolated versus connected. The Takarkori individuals carry Neanderthal ancestry at a level researchers measured at approximately 0.15% of their total genome, an amount roughly 10 times lower than that found in Levantine farming populations from the same general era, but still measurably higher than the Neanderthal ancestry found in contemporary sub-Saharan African genomes, where such ancestry is typically close to absent. The earlier Takarkori individuals, meanwhile, carried meaningfully more Neanderthal ancestry than the later Takarkori population did, roughly half the level found in populations outside Africa entirely, a substantially higher proportion than what the Takarkori genomes would later show. This declining trend in Neanderthal ancestry, from the earlier Takarkori population down to the later Takarkori population, adds further support to the broader picture of a population that, if anything, grew somewhat more genetically isolated over time rather than less, even as the landscape around them grew more hospitable and, in theory, more conducive to outside contact. It is a genuinely counterintuitive pattern. A green, water-rich Sahara should have invited more contact, not preserved or deepened isolation. And yet, the genetic evidence, measured with real precision across multiple independent lines of analysis, points toward exactly this less intuitive outcome. Researchers have proposed that limited small-scale contact with Levantine populations, the trace Near Eastern genetic influence detected in the Takarkori genomes, likely occurred through the very same routes that carried domesticated cattle and the knowledge of herding into the region in the first place, probably along the Mediterranean coast and then southward into the Saharan interior, or through more direct routes connecting the Eastern Sahara to the Nile Valley and the wider Near Eastern world beyond it. This would mean that new technology and a modest, measurable trickle of new ancestry arrived together through the same general channels of contact, while the much larger population to the south, across an equally transformed and equally green landscape, remained, for reasons the evidence cannot fully explain, largely disconnected from this specific North African lineage throughout the entire span of the Green Sahara's existence. They had revealed a population history no one had previously documented at all. Chapter 5. A bridge that was never crossed. For decades, the standard interpretation of the Green Sahara rested on a reasonable and intuitive assumption. Deserts function as barriers. They limit movement, discourage settlement, and separate populations that might otherwise mix freely. Remove the barrier, replace desert with grassland and lakes, and movement should follow. Populations on either side of a former desert should, over enough time, come into contact, exchange people through migration and intermarriage, and gradually blend genetically, the way water dissolves a boundary that sand once enforced. This assumption shaped how researchers, journalists, and educators alike described the Green Sahara for years. It appeared in museum exhibits, textbooks, and documentary narration long before the Takarkori genomes existed to test it. The logic was sound on its surface. Human populations do, in many well-documented cases across history, move toward resources, and water, in the middle of an otherwise impassable desert, represents about as significant a resource as exists. The genetic evidence recovered from the two Takarkori women directly challenges this assumption, at least for the specific population these women belonged to. Their ancestry showed no substantial genetic connection to populations from south of the Sahara, despite living squarely within the period when the region was at its greenest, wettest, and most theoretically passable. If large numbers of people had been moving freely between northern and sub-Saharan Africa during the humid period, mixing and settling among each other as the corridor theory predicts, that mixing should be visible in the genetic record. It should show up as shared ancestry, as genetic markers connecting the Takarkori population to communities from further south. It does not appear. This finding forces a more careful distinction between two related but very different things, the movement of people and the movement of ideas. The archaeological record at Takarkori and at related sites across the wider region clearly documents the arrival of new technology and new practices over time. Domesticated cattle did not originate locally. They, and the knowledge required to herd, breed, and eventually milk them, came from somewhere else, introduced into a population that had previously survived through fishing and gathering alone. The genetic evidence suggests, however, that this new technology likely did not arrive primarily through large-scale population movement and replacement. Instead, researchers now interpret the spread of pastoralism across the Green Sahara as occurring largely through cultural diffusion, the transmission of ideas, techniques, and possibly livestock themselves, through contact, trade, and exchange between neighboring groups, without requiring the kind of substantial migration and mixing that would have altered the underlying genetic makeup of the population absorbing these innovations. This is a genuinely important distinction, and one easy to overlook without direct genetic evidence to clarify it. A community can adopt an entirely new way of feeding itself, a new relationship with animals that reshapes daily labor, diet, and even settlement patterns, without that community itself being replaced or substantially mixed with outsiders. Cattle herding could spread across the Green Sahara the way a technique or a story spreads, passed from one group to a neighboring group, adopted, adapted, and integrated into existing ways of life, all while the population doing the adopting remained, at its genetic core, largely the same people it had always been. The pattern at Takarkori supports exactly this kind of transmission. The community's material culture shows clear continuity across the transition from a purely fishing and gathering economy to a partially pastoral one. The same rock shelter continued to be used. Similar tools, similar pottery styles, similar burial practices persisted across the transition, rather than being abruptly replaced by markedly different material culture that might suggest a new population had arrived and displaced the old one. Layered on top of this archaeological continuity, the genetic evidence now confirms what the material record had already suggested. This was fundamentally the same population, adapting and changing its practices, rather than one population replacing another. This reframing matters enormously for how the Green Sahara should be understood, not just as an environmental event, but as a chapter in human history. The corridor theory implied a landscape defined primarily by connection and exchange between distant populations, a place where the story belonged, in a sense, to everyone passing through it. The genetic evidence instead points towards something more specific and, in some ways, more remarkable, a landscape that supported a distinct, resident population across an extraordinary span of time, a homeland rather than merely a crossing point. It is worth pausing here to consider what this meant for daily life. If the Takarkori community was not a temporary population passing through a temporarily hospitable landscape, but rather a group with deep roots stretching back tens of thousands of years, then the transformation of the Sahara from desert to grassland, and eventually back to desert again, represents something closer to a multi-generational homeland experience than a brief window of opportunity exploited by outsiders. Children born during the earliest fishing and gathering period of the settlement's history, children born generations later during the transition to herding, and children born still later during the fully established pastoral period documented through dairy residue in ancient pottery, were, in a meaningful genetic sense, part of the same continuous community, separated by centuries or millennia, but connected by a shared, largely unbroken line of ancestry. This continuity did not mean isolation from all outside contact whatsoever. The evidence of Levantine genetic admixture shows some degree of contact occurred, likely through the north or northeast, bringing occasional new ancestry into the population, alongside the technological innovations arriving through similar routes. But the overall genetic character of the population remained remarkably stable, a pattern of persistence rather than replacement, even as the world immediately surrounding this community transformed dramatically, more than once, across the millennia they called this landscape home. There is a modern parallel worth considering carefully, without overstating it. Communities today sometimes maintain strong cultural and even genetic continuity across generations, occupying the same region for centuries, adopting new technology, new tools, new economic practices, while remaining recognizably rooted in a specific place and a specific lineage. Grandparents who worked one kind of livelihood, parents who adapted to different economic conditions, and children growing up with entirely different daily lives than their grandparents once knew, can still belong to an unbroken multi-generational thread tied to the same homeland. The Takarkori evidence suggests something structurally similar occurred across an almost unimaginably longer timescale, spanning not a few generations but tens of thousands of years, and not a few decades of economic change, but the complete transformation of an entire regional climate, not once, but as the Sahara shifted from dry to wet and back to dry again. The corridor theory was not entirely wrong about everything. Ideas moved, animals moved, techniques moved, carried by contact between neighboring groups across a landscape that genuinely had become more passable during the humid period. But the people themselves, at least in the case of the population these two women belonged to, largely stayed. And in staying, across tens of thousands of years and multiple dramatic climate transformations, they preserved something no other known population appears to have preserved in quite the same way. A direct, traceable genetic thread connecting hunter-gatherers from 15,000 years ago to pastoral herders from 7,000 years ago, all belonging to the same broad, resident North African lineage. It is worth considering, briefly, what this pattern of technological adoption without population replacement might have actually looked like in practice, at the scale of individual human contact rather than abstract population statistics. Cultural diffusion of this kind rarely happens through some anonymous, impersonal process. It happens through specific encounters, a small group of herders, perhaps traveling along established routes connecting different parts of the wider Green Sahara, arriving near a settlement like Takarkori and making contact with the established community there. Perhaps trade occurred, animals or breeding stock exchanged for other goods the traveling group needed. Perhaps intermarriage occurred on a small scale, consistent with the modest Levantine genetic signal detected in the Takarkori genomes, individuals from outside groups occasionally joining the established community, or vice versa, without ever approaching the scale of wholesale population replacement. Perhaps knowledge alone changed hands, community members watching, learning, and adapting herding techniques observed during periods of contact with traveling groups, without any significant movement of people at all. Any of these mechanisms, individually or in combination, could plausibly account for the pattern the genetic and archaeological evidence together reveal. New technology, new economic practices, and a small measurable trace of new ancestry, all arriving through the same general channels of contact, while the overwhelming majority of the population's genetic makeup remained continuous with ancestors who had lived in this same region for tens of thousands of years before cattle, or the knowledge of how to herd them, ever arrived. Archaeology and genetics together can identify that this pattern occurred. They cannot fully specify, with confidence, the precise social mechanics of every individual encounter that collectively produced it. That level of specific, individual human detail belongs to a history that, for a pre-literate population leaving behind no written record, remains permanently beyond full reconstruction, however clearly the broader pattern can now be documented. This raised an immediate and unavoidable follow-up question. If this population had remained this consistent, this rooted for this long, what happened to them? Because the lineage the two Takarkori women belonged to does not exist today in anything resembling its original, undiluted form. Something changed, and understanding what changed required looking closely not just at who these women were, but at what happened to the landscape and the population after they died. Chapter 6: The Lakes That Disappeared Twice. The story of the Green Sahara is not the story of one gradual, steady transformation. It is the story of a landscape that changed its mind more than once, and the evidence at Takarkori captures this instability in unusual detail, complicating any simple narrative of a population that merely settled into a stable, unchanging paradise for 10,000 years. The African humid period itself was not a single uninterrupted stretch of favorable climate. Researchers studying sediment layers, animal remains, and pollen records across the region have identified meaningful fluctuations within it, periods of relative dryness interrupting the broader wet phase and shifts in water availability that would have directly affected the community living at Takarkori. The clearest evidence for this comes from tracking the aquatic animal remains recovered from the site across its long occupation. Fish bones, abundant in the earliest layers associated with the late Achicus hunter-gatherer fishers, do not remain constant across the entire sequence. Researchers have documented a clear decline over time, both in the overall quantity of fish remains and in the average size of the fish being caught. This pattern points toward a specific and significant environmental change, the shrinking of available water sources, forcing the remaining fish populations into smaller, more crowded, and ultimately less productive habitats. This decline was not smooth or constant. During the early pastoral period, roughly 8,300 to 7,300 years ago, researchers have identified evidence suggesting the smaller lakes in the immediate region suffered under a climatic shift, likely a phase of reduced rainfall interrupting the broader wet period. This would have directly threatened a community still significantly dependent on fishing as a primary food source, even as they were beginning to integrate the first domesticated animals into their economy. Remarkably, not every water source in the region disappeared during this drier phase. Two specific bodies of water, referred to in the research record as Takarkori Lake and Garat Uda, persisted through this difficulty and continued to exist well into the following middle pastoral period. Their survival, even as other nearby lakes dried up or shrank dramatically, likely explains why the Takarkori rock shelter itself remained a viable, repeatedly occupied settlement across this turbulent stretch of climate history, even as the broader region around it grew less reliable. This detail complicates any simple image of the Green Sahara as a landscape that was uniformly green and water-rich for 10,000 straight years before abruptly turning to desert. The reality documented at Takarkori was more turbulent, a landscape experiencing real internal fluctuation, with some water sources failing, while others, for reasons tied to local geography and groundwater conditions, managed to persist. The community's continued presence at this specific location, generation after generation, may owe something directly to the fact that Takarkori itself sat above unusually resilient water sources, even as the broader region around it became less predictable. The pastoral economy that developed at Takarkori during and after this drier interlude also shows signs of adaptation in response to changing conditions. Archaeological evidence indicates a shift, over time, from cattle towards smaller domesticated animals, likely sheep and goats, animals generally better suited to surviving in drier, less grass-rich conditions than cattle require. This shift makes practical sense as a direct community response to a landscape offering less reliable grazing than it once had, a population adjusting its economic strategy in real time as their environment changed around them, rather than abandoning the region outright. Even as fish became a less reliable food source and the community's economy shifted increasingly toward herding, evidence from the chemical analysis of ancient pottery indicates that water remained a consistent presence in the community's life throughout this period, even during phases of increasing regional aridity. This detail, drawn from isotope analysis of pottery residues, suggests the immediate area around Takarkori retained access to water even as broader environmental conditions grew more difficult, reinforcing the picture of this specific location as an unusually resilient refuge within a wider landscape undergoing real and sometimes severe fluctuation. This period of instability and adaptation also offers an important corrective to any oversimplified reading of the genetic continuity established in the previous chapter. A population remaining genetically stable across tens of thousands of years did not mean a population immune to hardship, disruption, or difficult adjustment. It meant a population that endured real environmental instability, adapted its economic strategies in response, and, crucially, continued to do so without being displaced or genetically overwhelmed by outside populations who might have been expected to move in during moments of local vulnerability. There is a meaningful human dimension buried within these environmental fluctuations that deserves attention. A community watching fish populations shrink year after year, while gradually learning to depend more heavily on herded animals instead, was living through a slow, multi-generational transition, not a single dramatic event. Grandparents in this community may have grown up relying primarily on fishing, much as generations before them had for thousands of years. Their grandchildren may have grown up in a world where herding, not fishing, formed the backbone of daily food security. Neither generation likely experienced this shift as a single sudden crisis. It would have unfolded gradually, adjustment by adjustment, across a human lifetime and beyond. The kind of change a community absorbs and adapts to, rather than one it experiences as catastrophe. This adaptability appears to have served the Takarkori population well for a very long time. The persistence of Takarkori Lake and Garat Uda through the difficult early pastoral period brought the community additional centuries of continuity, additional generations able to remain rooted in the same landscape their ancestors had occupied for thousands of years before them, adapting their economic strategy without abandoning their homeland or losing the genetic continuity that had defined them since roughly the time modern humans first began moving out of Africa altogether. But resilience has limits, and the deeper climate trend working against this community was not a temporary fluctuation. It was the slow, ultimately irreversible closing of the African humid period itself, a process that had already begun reshaping the landscape around Takarkori and would, eventually, bring an end to the very conditions that had sustained this community's way of life for so many thousands of years. The two women whose burials would eventually reveal so much about their population's deep ancestry lived and died during the Middle Pastoral period, a time when Takarkori Lake and Garat Uda still held water, when cattle herding alongside diminishing fishing still sustained the community, and when the full severity of what was coming had not yet arrived. They did not live to see the desert return, but the evidence buried in the landscape around their graves makes clear that the return of the desert was already, by the time they were born, no longer a distant hypothetical. It was underway. It would be a mistake to treat the Takarkori findings as describing the entire Green Sahara, as though every community living across this vast, transformed landscape shared the same deeply isolated history these two women's genomes revealed. The Sahara during the African humid period was not one uniform place with one uniform population. It was an enormous region, larger than most modern countries combined, containing many different lakes, many different river systems, and, the evidence increasingly suggests, many different human communities, each with its own local history, its own relationship to the surrounding landscape, and, in at least one dramatically documented case, its own far more turbulent population story. Roughly 1,000 miles to the southwest of Takarkori, in what is now the Tenere Desert of Niger, lies a site called Gobero, where Takarkori offers a single rock shelter with a long, continuous sequence of burials. Gobero offers something different, a cluster of closely spaced sites surrounding an ancient paleolake, containing approximately 200 human burials spanning roughly 5,000 years of Holocene population and environmental change. It represents one of the most extensively documented human cemetery complexes anywhere in the Sahara, and its story, when placed alongside the Takarkori findings, adds a genuinely important layer of complexity to the broader picture. The earliest occupants at Gobero, dating to a period researchers place at roughly 7,700 to 6,200 years before the Common Era, were largely settled hunter-fisher-gatherers, building their lives, much like the earliest Takarkori residents, around the resources offered by a nearby lake. Their burials, found in an unusual hyperflexed position with limbs drawn tightly toward the body, represent among the earliest formal cemetery burials documented anywhere in the Sahara. Craniometric analysis, meaning careful measurement and comparison of skull structure across different populations, links these early Gobero occupants to a broader cluster of related populations spanning the Maghreb region of northwest Africa and the wider southern Sahara during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Then, according to the evidence recovered from the site, something happened at Gobero that did not happen at Takarkori. The site was abandoned, entirely, for a period researchers estimate may have lasted as long as a full millennium, corresponding to a phase of severe aridification that made the surrounding landscape unable to sustain the community that had lived there for centuries. When people eventually returned to Gobero, resettling the area during the mid-Holocene, the skeletal evidence tells a different story than simple continuity. The individuals who returned to Gobero were physically distinct from those who had lived there before the abandonment, more gracile in build, following a more diversified economy that combined fishing for clams, hunting savanna animals, and increasingly cattle herding. Researchers studying Gobero have concluded that the most likely explanation for this pattern is population replacement, not population continuity. Unlike Takarkori, where genetic evidence now confirms a single, deeply continuous lineage persisting across the entire span of the site's long occupation, the evidence from Gobero points toward an actual break, a period when the original population's presence in this specific location ended, followed by resettlement by a different, physically distinguishable population once conditions became viable again. This contrast matters enormously for understanding what the Takarkori findings do, and do not, tell us about the Green Sahara as a whole. It confirms that the deep genetic continuity documented at Takarkori was not simply an automatic, guaranteed outcome of living in this transformed, temporarily hospitable landscape. It was instead a specific, notable feature of this particular population, in this particular location, that other communities living across the wider Green Sahara did not necessarily share. Some populations, like the one eventually documented through the two Takarkori women, remained rooted in place across dramatic climate fluctuation. Others, like the population at Gobero, experienced genuine displacement, absence, and eventual replacement when conditions became too severe to sustain continuous habitation. Further evidence complicating any single uniform narrative comes from additional sites across the wider region. Human remains recovered from Ouan Muhugiag, another site within the same broader Libyan Sahara region as Takarkori, and from Nabta Playa, an extensively studied Neolithic complex in the western desert of Egypt, show skeletal and population affinities, suggesting connections with populations living south of the Sahara, a pattern notably different from the deep, sustained isolation documented through the Takarkori genomes. Nabta Playa itself represents a remarkable site in its own right, a place where seasonal occupation, hearths, cattle remains, and eventually a sophisticated megalithic stone structure, possibly used for tracking seasonal solar movements relevant to the region's rainy season, developed over centuries of use, reflecting a community whose relationship to the landscape and to seasonal water availability shaped their culture in specific, locally distinctive ways. Taken together, these comparative sites suggest that the story of who lived in the Green Sahara and how connected or isolated they were from populations beyond it cannot be reduced to one single answer covering the entire region. Some evidence points toward populations with clear connections to the south. Other evidence, most directly and most precisely documented through the Takarkori genomes, points toward populations that remained remarkably separate from those same southern connections, despite living within a broadly similar environmental context. This regional variation makes sense when the true scale of the Green Sahara is properly appreciated. A landscape this large, transformed this dramatically, over a period spanning close to 10,000 years, was never likely to produce one single, uniform human population story. Different communities, living around different lakes, following different economic strategies, experiencing different specific local patterns of climate fluctuation, likely followed genuinely different historical trajectories, even while sharing the broader experience of watching their environment transform from desert to grassland and eventually back to desert again. What makes Takarkori's specific story so significant is not that it represents the entire Green Sahara's population history in miniature. It is that it represents the first time researchers have been able to test any specific local population's history directly, using the kind of hard genetic evidence that skeletal analysis and archaeological context alone cannot fully provide. The picture emerging from Takarkori is one detailed, richly documented thread within a much larger, still only partially understood regional tapestry, one that future ancient DNA research at sites like Gobero, Nabta Playa, and others across the wider Sahara will likely continue to test, confirm, complicate, and refine for years to come. The two women at the center of this investigation, then, do not speak for every community that ever lived across the Green Sahara's vast expanse. They speak, with unusual clarity and unusual confidence, for one specific, remarkably persistent population rooted in one specific corner of a transformed continent, whose long, continuous presence there stands out precisely because it was not, evidently, the only way a human community could have experienced this dramatic chapter of Saharan history. Chapter 7. What their bodies could still say. Returning to the two women at the center of this investigation, it is worth slowing down and considering exactly what researchers were able to determine about them as individuals, separate from the broader population history their genomes eventually revealed. Both women were adults at the time of death, buried within the Middle Pastoral period at Takarkori, in a time frame researchers place at roughly 6,800 to 7,200 years ago. Their burials were located deep within the rock shelter, in a position offering meaningful protection from the more extreme surface conditions affecting the broader region. This placement was very likely not accidental. A community capable of building durable stone structures, maintaining hearths across generations, and developing sophisticated basket weaving techniques was also, the evidence suggests, deliberate about how and where its dead were laid to rest. Unlike many of the other burials recovered from the same shelter, these two women retained soft tissue, skin, ligaments, and other organic material that, under normal conditions, breaks down and disappears within decades, not millennia. This preservation was almost certainly the product of a specific and somewhat fortunate combination of circumstances, rather than any deliberate embalming or mummification practice. Consistent, dry conditions within the sheltered burial location, combined with limited exposure to the extreme surface temperature swings affecting more exposed areas, appear to have naturally preserved these two individuals far better than most human remains recovered from similar desert environments anywhere in the world. Researchers involved in recovering and studying the remains noted specifically that these two burials stood out immediately during excavation because of this unusual preservation. It was this quality, more than any other single factor, that led scientists to select these particular two individuals out of the 15 burials present at the site for the specific attempt at ancient DNA recovery that would eventually prove successful. Their bodies offered the best remaining chance, anywhere at Takarkori, of holding genetic material intact enough to analyze. It is worth pausing on the specific historical weight of that success. Prior to this study, no human genome had ever been successfully sequenced from remains recovered from an environment this hot and this arid, anywhere in the world. The achievement carries significance well beyond this single site, opening a genuine possibility that other, similarly preserved remains from comparably difficult desert environments elsewhere in North Africa, and potentially other arid regions entirely, might eventually yield equally valuable genetic information that has, until now, been assumed permanently lost to heat and time. Beyond their crucial role in preserving usable genetic material, what else can researchers responsibly say about who these two women were as individuals? This question requires real care. Ancient DNA and skeletal analysis can reveal genuine, meaningful information, broad ancestry, general health indicators, sometimes diet through chemical isotope analysis, and demographic details like approximate age at death. It cannot reveal personal names, individual personalities, specific relationships, or private thoughts and beliefs. Responsible interpretation of this evidence requires resisting the temptation to invent details the evidence does not actually support, however emotionally satisfying such invented details might feel. What can be said, based directly on the available evidence, paints a picture grounded in what the wider Takarkori burial pattern already suggested. These two women lived within a community where women and children were disproportionately represented among the burials associated with the site's earliest pastoral period, and where women continued to be prominently represented among burials throughout the site's long occupation. Whatever combination of social structure, community roles, or burial customs produced this pattern, it meant that the two women who would eventually reveal so much about their population's deep genetic history were, in a very real sense, representative of who was actually being buried, generation after generation, within this specific, sheltered space. Their community, based on the wider archaeological evidence already established at the site, was one where fishing had given way gradually to herding, where milk from domesticated cattle had become a documented part of the diet by the time these women were alive, where woven baskets using multiple distinct techniques were produced with clear skill, and where pottery was decorated using pigments sourced from the local landscape. This was not, by any reasonable evidentiary standard, a marginal or struggling population barely surviving at the edge of habitability. It was a community with established craft traditions, a diversified food economy, combining herding with whatever fishing remained viable, and evidently enough social continuity to maintain consistent burial practices across many generations. The genetic analysis of the two women revealed one additional detail worth highlighting carefully, without overstating its significance. Because researchers were able to recover genome-wide data from both individuals, they were able to compare the two women's genetic profiles directly against one another, in addition to comparing each against the broader database of ancient and modern population genetics. This comparison confirmed that both women belonged to the same broad ancestral lineage, the previously undocumented North African population branch described in the previous chapters. Whether the two women were closely related to each other as individuals, such as being part of the same extended family, is a more specific question that requires additional genetic analysis beyond simply establishing shared broad ancestry, and researchers have been appropriately careful not to overstate a close family relationship without stronger direct evidence supporting it. What can be said with confidence is this: both women were, without doubt, part of the same long continuous North African population that had occupied this landscape, adapting across dramatic environmental change for tens of thousands of years before either of them was born. In this sense, whether or not they were related as individuals, they were certainly related as members of the same deep lineage, connected not only to each other, but to the 15,000-year-old foragers recovered from Tafaralt Cave in Morocco, and, through that connection, to a population history stretching back to roughly the same era when other human populations were beginning the long migrations that would eventually carry human ancestry across the rest of the world. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that it was specifically these two women, out of everyone ever buried across the Green Sahara's many known archaeological sites, who ended up holding the evidence capable of answering a question archaeologists had been asking for decades. Not a king, not a warrior, not a figure marked by any special monument or inscription distinguishing their grave from the others surrounding it. Two women, buried according to the same customs applied to the rest of their community, preserved by fortunate circumstance rather than any deliberate attempt to be remembered, ended up becoming the sole surviving witnesses, in the most literal genetic sense, to an entire population's forgotten history. Their preservation was accidental, its consequences were not small. Because of these two burials, an entire understanding of how the Green Sahara actually functioned, who lived there, and what happened to them, had to be substantially reconsidered. And that reconsideration extended beyond academic debate about migration corridors and population genetics. It reached directly into the deeper, harder question of what eventually happened to this long, resilient, deeply rooted population once the landscape that had sustained them for so many thousands of years began, permanently this time, to disappear. One detail from the Takarkori burial record deserves closer, more careful attention than a passing mention allows. The fact that the earliest pastoral period graves at the site are overwhelmingly women and children, a pattern that continues, in modified form, across much of the shelter's long burial history. This is not a minor statistical curiosity. It shapes almost everything about how this population's story can be responsibly told, because it means the physical evidence available to researchers, the very bodies capable of carrying genetic and skeletal information forward across 7,000 years, belonged disproportionately to women and to the children in their care. Archaeologists studying burial patterns across prehistoric sites generally resist simple single-cause explanations for why a particular demographic group might be disproportionately represented in a specific burial context. Several possibilities can reasonably be considered, and responsible interpretation requires holding more than one in mind, rather than defaulting to the most dramatic available explanation. It is possible that this particular chamber within the rock shelter held specific social or ceremonial significance connected to women and children specifically, reflecting a burial custom whose exact meaning is not fully recoverable from the physical evidence alone. It is possible that patterns of seasonal occupation meant women and children were more likely to be present, or more likely to die, at this specific location during the specific periods reflected in these burials, while other members of the community were more often elsewhere, following herds or traveling for other purposes not preserved in the archaeological record. It is possible that broader patterns of mortality within the community, patterns common across many prehistoric populations worldwide, meant women faced particular risks tied to childbirth, and children faced particular vulnerability in their earliest years, contributing to a higher proportion of burials among these specific groups relative to their overall share of the living population. No single explanation can be stated with full confidence based on the currently available evidence, and it would be irresponsible to present any one of these possibilities as a settled conclusion. What can be said clearly is that this burial pattern places women and their children at the physical center of the Takarkori story, in a very literal sense. They are who the site preserved, they are who the excavations recovered, and ultimately, they are who held the specific genetic evidence capable of finally answering questions about this population's deep ancestry that had remained open for decades. This connects directly and meaningfully to a broader pattern visible throughout prehistoric archaeology more generally, one worth naming plainly. The physical evidence available to researchers studying ancient human populations is not evenly or randomly distributed across every category of person who once lived. Burial customs, patterns of who traveled and who remained near a settled shelter, and countless other social and practical factors specific to each individual community all shape which bodies survive to be found, and therefore which bodies are available to answer scientific questions thousands of years later. At Takarkori, this meant that when the moment finally arrived to test the corridor theory directly, when the specific genetic evidence needed to settle a decades-old scientific question finally became available, it was two women who provided that answer, not because researchers set out specifically to study female ancestry, but because these two women were who the accident of preservation and burial practice had placed within reach. This is worth stating plainly because it reframes what the discovery actually represents. It is not, primarily, a story about women's biology, women's reproductive roles, or any claimed universal female trait. It is a story about which members of an ancient community happened to be buried in a location and preserved in a condition that made this particular scientific breakthrough possible at all. The women themselves, based on everything the wider Takarkori evidence reveals about their community, very likely participated across the full range of activities documented at the site, processing and likely producing the pottery decorated with locally sourced pigment, contributing to the sophisticated basket weaving traditions the site is known for, participating in the shift from fishing toward herding that reshaped the community's economy across their lifetimes, and, the evidence of milk residue in pottery suggests, quite possibly involved directly in the processing of dairy products that the chemical analysis of Takarkori vessels has confirmed. There is a meaningful distinction worth holding on to here, between recognizing that women happen to be central to how this discovery became possible, and assuming that this centrality reflects some deeper, universal truth about women's biological resilience, women's role in prehistoric society generally, or any broader claim the specific evidence from this one site cannot actually support. The two women whose genomes rewrote understanding of the Green Sahara were not selected because they were women. They were selected because their remains happened to be the best preserved among the burials recovered from this specific site, a site where, for reasons that remain only partially understood, women and children were disproportionately represented among those laid to rest. What this does allow, responsibly, is a recognition of these two individuals, and the broader community of women and children whose graves surround theirs within the same sheltered rock formation, as full and complete participants in one of the most significant chapters of North African prehistory yet documented. They were not passive figures waiting at home while history happened elsewhere. They were, according to every strand of evidence available, active participants in a community that fished, gathered, wove, herded, processed milk, decorated pottery, and adapted across generations to one of the most dramatic environmental transformations any human population has ever experienced, and then, in the case of these two women specifically, without any possible awareness of what their preserved remains would eventually reveal, became the sole surviving witnesses to that population's entire deep genetic history. Their children, present in these same graves in significant numbers, deserve acknowledgement as well, even though the evidence available about their specific lives is understandably more limited. Children born within this community across its many centuries of occupation grew up within a rock shelter that had already sheltered countless earlier generations, learning skills presumably from the adults around them. The basket-weaving techniques whose 8 distinct methods survive in fragments recovered from the site, the pottery decoration traditions using locally sourced pigment, and eventually, as the community's economy shifted, the skills required to herd, manage, and eventually milk domesticated cattle. Whatever specific circumstances led to their deaths and their burial within this particular chamber, their presence, alongside the women who very likely cared for them, forms an essential and inseparable part of the community whose deep genetic history this investigation has finally been able to document with real confidence. Chapter 8: The Desert That Came Back. The African humid period did not end suddenly, in the way a single dramatic event ends. It closed gradually, over centuries, as the same shift in Earth's orbital pattern that had originally pulled monsoon rains deep into North Africa slowly reversed, withdrawing that moisture and allowing the desert conditions common across the region, both before and after this exceptional wet interval, to reassert themselves. For the community at Takarkori, this meant the resilience that had carried them through earlier, temporary dry spells eventually met a challenge that did not reverse itself. Takarkori Lake and Garat Uda, the 2 water sources that had persisted through the early pastoral period difficulties and helped sustain the community across centuries of gradual environmental change, did not survive indefinitely. Researchers studying the region's hydrological history have documented the total loss of both lakes by approximately 5,000 years ago, marking a definitive end to the specific combination of water resources that had made this particular location a viable, repeatedly occupied settlement for thousands of years. This was not an isolated local event. Across the wider Sahara, similar water sources were disappearing during roughly the same period, as the broader climate shift that had created the Green Sahara in the first place reversed at a landscape-wide scale. Grasslands that had supported herds of grazing animals for thousands of years gave way to expanding areas of open sand. Rivers that had carried seasonal water across vast distances slowed, then stopped. The animals whose presence had been so vividly recorded in the region's rock art, the hippos, the crocodiles, the large fish populations that had sustained early Takarkori residents, gradually disappeared from a landscape no longer capable of supporting them. For the human population living across this transforming region, the end of the African humid period presented an urgent, unavoidable question with no easy answer. Stay and adapt to steadily worsening conditions, or leave in search of environments still capable of sustaining a herding or fishing-based way of life. The archaeological and genetic evidence available from Takarkori and comparable sites suggests different communities across the broader region likely answered this question in different ways, based on their own local circumstances, the specific resources still available to them, and factors that remain difficult to reconstruct with full certainty from the evidence currently available. What the genetic evidence does make clear is that the distinct North African lineage carried by the 2 Takarkori women, the lineage that had persisted with remarkable continuity across tens of thousands of years and multiple earlier climate fluctuations, does not exist today in anything resembling its original, undiluted form. Modern populations across North Africa carry only a partial genetic echo of this ancient lineage, blended over subsequent millennia with genetic contributions from numerous other populations that moved into and across the region during the thousands of years following the desert's return. This raises an important and carefully qualified point about how this ancient population's legacy should be understood. The lineage did not simply vanish, in the sense of leaving no trace. Genetic analysis confirms that this ancestry remains a measurable, real component of the genetic makeup of North African populations living today. meaning the descendants of the Takarkori community and others like them did not disappear from the human story entirely. But the specific, distinct, largely unmixed genetic profile carried by the two women studied in this research, a profile that had remained remarkably stable for tens of thousands of years, gradually diluted and blended following the return of desert conditions, as surviving populations moved, mixed, and integrated with other groups migrating into and through the region in the millennia since. This process likely unfolded gradually, not as a single displacement event, but as a long series of smaller-scale movements, contacts, and gradual population shifts occurring across the same broad region over thousands of subsequent years. Populations retreating from a drying interior likely moved toward the remaining pockets of viable water and grazing land, including areas along the Nile Valley, coastal regions near the Mediterranean, and other more consistently habitable zones across North Africa. In these more crowded, more consistently occupied regions, genetic mixing with other populations, populations with their own distinct histories and their own ancestral lineages, would have occurred far more readily than it had within the relatively isolated interior of the Green Sahara during its wet, resource-rich centuries. There is a specific and important distinction worth making here, because it is easy to unintentionally overstate what the evidence shows. The disappearance of a distinct, unmixed genetic lineage through gradual population blending is a fundamentally different kind of historical event than the violent destruction or extinction of a population. Nothing in the archaeological or genetic evidence from Takarkori suggests catastrophe, conquest, or sudden population collapse. It suggests something closer to gradual absorption, descendants of this ancient, long-isolated population continuing to exist, continuing to have children, continuing to pass on genetic material, but doing so within an increasingly connected and genetically diverse regional population, rather than within the kind of long-isolated community their ancestors had maintained for tens of thousands of years before the desert's return forced broader movement and mixing. The specific rock shelter at Takarkori itself was not abandoned instantly either. Evidence indicates occupation continued, in some reduced or altered form, into what researchers term the late pastoral period, even as the broader region grew increasingly arid and increasingly difficult to sustain a settled population within. But the specific combination of circumstances that had made Takarkori a viable, repeatedly occupied home for a genetically continuous community across thousands of years, reliable water, sustainable grazing, and enough surrounding resources to support fishing alongside herding, eventually gave way entirely to the same encroaching desert conditions that define the region today. It is worth returning, briefly, to the two women themselves within this broader context. They lived and died during the Middle Pastoral period, meaning they did not personally witness the final, most severe phase of desertification that would, centuries after their deaths, bring an end to their community's long occupation of this specific landscape. But the earlier evidence of fluctuating lake levels, declining fish populations, and a gradual economic shift toward more drought-resistant herded animals suggests these two women likely lived through and adapted to real environmental instability within their own lifetimes, even if the most severe and permanent transformation still lay generations ahead of them. It is worth trying to hold, honestly and without exaggeration, what this slow transformation likely meant across the generations that lived through its final, most severe phase. Generations who came after the two women at the center of this investigation, but who remained connected to them through the same long, continuous lineage. A grandmother in this final stretch of Takarkori's occupation may have grown up hearing about, or even remembering firsthand, a lake nearby that her own grandchildren would never see, a body of water reduced first to a smaller, shrinking pool, and eventually to nothing but a dry basin, indistinguishable from the surrounding desert. Herds that had once grazed on open grassland would have required longer and longer journeys to find adequate pasture, as the grassland itself steadily retreated and fragmented. Fishing, already in decline for generations by the time the final late pastoral period began, would have become an increasingly marginal, unreliable activity, practiced perhaps only in memory of what earlier generations had relied upon so heavily. This was not, by any available evidence, a sudden catastrophe experienced within a single lifetime. It was a slow, generational erosion of the specific resources that had made this landscape a viable, resilient homeland for longer than almost any other documented human population lineage anywhere in the world. Communities facing this kind of gradual, multi-generational environmental decline generally do not experience it as a single dramatic crisis demanding an immediate, single decisive response. They experience it as a long series of smaller adjustments, each one reasonable given the conditions at the time, traveling a little further for water this season than last, relying a little more heavily on herded animals and a little less on fish, perhaps sending some family members toward more consistently viable regions, while others remained, for as long as possible, rooted in the specific place their ancestors had called home for thousands of years before them. Their genetic legacy, preserved by chance within their unusually well-protected burials, ultimately outlasted the landscape that had shaped their entire community's way of life. The lakes disappeared, the grasslands disappeared, the hippos and crocodiles and large fish populations recorded so vividly in the region's ancient rock art disappeared entirely from a landscape no longer capable of sustaining them. But something did survive, buried deep within a sheltered rock formation in the Tadrat Akakis Mountains, a genetic record more durable in the end than the water, the grass, or the animals that had once surrounded these two women during their lives, waiting 7,000 years for the right combination of scientific advancement and fortunate preservation to finally allow it to speak. Chapter 9. What this changes about Africa's deep history. The discovery at Takarkori did more than answer a specific regional question about who lived in the Green Sahara. It forced a broader reconsideration of how researchers understand population movement, isolation, and genetic diversity across the African continent as a whole, during a period of human history that remains, in general, poorly represented in ancient DNA studies compared to other parts of the world. This gap in the existing evidence base is itself worth understanding, because it explains why the Takarkori findings carry weight well beyond this single site. Africa is the continent where modern humans originated, and the continent that has, as a result, hosted human populations for by far the longest continuous span of time anywhere in the world. Despite this, ancient DNA studies focused specifically on African populations have historically lagged behind similar research conducted on populations in Europe and parts of Asia, largely due to exactly the preservation challenges this story has already described in detail. Hot climates across much of the continent have made recovering usable ancient DNA extremely difficult, leaving researchers to rely more heavily on comparatively abundant modern population genetic data, supplemented by a much smaller and more geographically limited set of successful ancient DNA recoveries, when reconstructing the deep genetic history of the continent. This imbalance has real consequences for how confidently researchers can reconstruct Africa's deep population history. Modern genetic data can reveal a great deal about present-day population relationships and, through careful analysis, can support informed inferences about historical population movements. But it cannot fully substitute for direct ancient DNA evidence, which offers something modern data alone cannot, a genetic snapshot frozen at a specific moment in the past, unaffected by all of the population movement, mixing, and change that has occurred in the thousands of years since. Every successful ancient DNA recovery from an African site, particularly from a hot, historically difficult environment like the Sahara, meaningfully expands researchers' ability to reconstruct this deep history with direct, rather than inferred, evidence. The Takarkori findings specifically strengthen the case for a broader pattern researchers have increasingly documented in recent years. Rather than a single uniform African population gradually diversifying outward as people migrated to other continents, the deep population history of Africa itself appears to have involved multiple distinct, long-isolated regional lineages, each accumulating its own genetic distinctiveness over tens of thousands of years, in a pattern more genetically diverse and more regionally structured than earlier, simpler models had assumed. The previously undocumented North African lineage revealed through the two Takarkori women's genomes represents one specific, now well-documented example of this broader pattern. A population that branched off from other human lineages. At roughly the same time, other populations began migrating out of Africa entirely, and that then remained substantially distinct and regionally rooted for tens of thousands of years afterward. This finding also meaningfully clarifies the specific relationship between North African and Sub-Saharan African population history during the Green Sahara period, correcting what had been, until now, a largely untested assumption rather than a directly evidenced conclusion. The absence of substantial genetic connection between the Takarkori population and sub-Saharan African populations, despite the theoretically favorable conditions the humid period offered for exactly this kind of contact, suggests that whatever significant genetic exchange did eventually occur between northern and sub-Saharan African populations occurred through different routes, different timeframes, or different mechanisms than a simple, direct Green Sahara migration corridor operating at full capacity throughout the humid period. This does not mean no contact whatsoever occurred between northern and sub-Saharan populations during this era. It means the specific direct genetic mixing implied by the corridor theory, in its simplest and most widely assumed form, is not supported by the strongest available direct evidence, at least not for the specific population and specific site this evidence comes from. Other regions of the Green Sahara, other communities living across this vast landscape during the same broad period, may well show different patterns, and researchers studying additional sites and additional ancient genomes across the wider region will likely continue refining and testing this picture as more evidence becomes available. The dairying evidence recovered from Takarkori pottery also gains additional significance within this broader genetic context. Knowing now that the population processing this milk was very likely the same long continuous North African lineage documented through the two women's genomes, rather than a population that had recently arrived from elsewhere alongside the cattle themselves, strengthens the interpretation that pastoralism spread across the Green Sahara primarily as a transmitted practice, adopted by existing populations, rather than as a population replacement event carried out by incoming herding groups, displacing whoever had lived in the region before them. This distinction carries meaningful implications for understanding the broader spread of pastoralism across Africa more generally, a topic of significant ongoing research interest well beyond the Sahara specifically. If cattle herding could spread this effectively through cultural transmission alone, without requiring large-scale population movement to carry the practice from one region to the next, it suggests early African populations were capable of adopting significant new economic and technological practices through contact, trade, and cultural exchange alone, a capacity for flexible, contact-based cultural transmission that some earlier models of prehistoric technological spread had perhaps underestimated in favor of simpler migration-based explanations. There is also a broader lesson here about the limits of archaeology conducted without direct genetic evidence, one relevant well beyond this specific site or region. For decades, researchers studying the Green Sahara worked with genuinely excellent environmental and archaeological evidence, detailed climate reconstructions, extensive rock art documentation, careful excavation of settlement sites and burial contexts, and increasingly sophisticated chemical analysis of diet and material culture. This body of evidence supported a reasonable, carefully reasoned interpretation of the region's history. And yet, without direct genetic evidence, that interpretation contained a significant gap, one that could only be closed through exactly the kind of technically difficult, previously unsuccessful genetic recovery effort that finally succeeded with these two specific burials. This is not a criticism of the researchers who developed and worked with the corridor theory for decades before genetic evidence became available to test it directly. It is, instead, a demonstration of how science actually advances, through careful interpretation of the best available evidence at any given time, followed by a willingness to substantially revise that interpretation when new, more direct evidence becomes available and points toward a different conclusion. The corridor theory was a reasonable hypothesis, built on genuinely available evidence and sound reasoning about how human populations generally behave when environmental barriers disappear. The genetic evidence from Takarkori did not prove that reasoning to be foolish. It simply provided the first opportunity to test the hypothesis directly, and the direct test told a more specific, more surprising story than the general reasoning alone had predicted. Understanding exactly how this ancient lineage relates to people living across North Africa today requires real care, because the genetic picture of the modern region is, itself, considerably more layered than any single ancient population alone could explain. Researchers studying present-day North African populations, including groups with long-documented Amazigh or Berber cultural and linguistic heritage, have identified genetic contributions from several distinct historical sources, arriving across many thousands of years. An underlying indigenous North African ancestry connected to the deep lineage this investigation has traced back through Takarkori and Tafaralt, later Neolithic farming ancestry associated with population movements from the Iberian Peninsula and the Levant, thousands of years after the Green Sahara's decline. Subsequent genetic contributions tied to Phoenician and Roman-era Mediterranean contact, and still later genetic influence connected to the 7th century Islamic expansion and the centuries of trans-Saharan trade and, in some documented cases, forced migration through the historical slave trade that followed. This layered picture means the ancient North African lineage carried by the two Takarkori women represents one thread within a much larger, more complex genetic tapestry, not the entire story of who North Africans are today. Researchers studying modern Amazigh populations specifically have noted that this deep, indigenous ancestral component tends to be more strongly represented in certain regions and communities than others, though it remains, in careful, measured form, a real and traceable part of the broader regional genetic inheritance across much of North Africa. It would be inaccurate and a disservice to the genuine complexity of the evidence to suggest that any single modern population represents an unbroken, undiluted continuation of the specific lineage documented at Takarkori. It would be equally inaccurate to suggest that lineage left no lasting trace at all. The honest answer sits between these two extremes: a real, measurable, but thoroughly blended genetic inheritance, carried forward across thousands of subsequent years of additional contact, migration, and mixing that reshaped the region again and again after the desert's return. None of this diminishes the significance of the African humid period itself as a genuine, well-documented environmental transformation. The Sahara really did turn green. Lakes really did fill dry basins. Hippos and crocodiles and diverse fish populations really did live across a landscape that supports almost none of them today. What the Takarkori evidence changes is not whether this transformation happened, but who experienced it, and what that experience meant for the specific population living through it. Not a temporary population of migrants passing through an unusually hospitable corridor, but a long-rooted, deeply continuous community, experiencing this dramatic environmental transformation as their own homeland story, generation after generation, for longer than almost any other documented human population lineage anywhere in the world. Chapter 10. What Remains Today. The two women recovered from the Takarkori rock shelter no longer rest in the ground where they were originally buried. Their remains, along with the genetic data extracted from them, now exist within the careful custody of researchers and, ultimately, within the published scientific record, available for other scientists to examine, question, and build upon as this field of research continues to develop. This transition, from an undisturbed grave inside a mountain shelter to a subject of international scientific study, deserves a moment of honest reflection, because it reflects a broader pattern present throughout archaeology and genetics, wherever ancient human remains are involved. Researchers working on studies like this one generally approach such work with real awareness of its weight. These were, after all, actual people who lived actual lives within a real community, who were buried according to customs their community considered meaningful, likely by people who had known and cared about them. The scientific value of their remains does not erase the fact that they were, first, individual human beings, whose personal experiences, relationships, and inner lives remain almost entirely outside what any amount of genetic or archaeological analysis can recover or claim to understand. What research of this kind can responsibly offer is different, and in its own way, still significant. A genuine, evidence-based reconstruction of the broader population and environmental context these two women lived within, built from careful, verifiable evidence rather than invention or assumption. This is not the same as knowing who they were as individuals. It is a way of understanding, with real confidence, the deep, until now hidden history of the population they belonged to, and by extension, honoring the reality of their community's long, resilient, largely unbroken presence in this landscape, across a span of time longer than most currently documented human population lineages anywhere else in the world. The legacy of this ancient North African lineage, though no longer preserved in anything resembling its original, undiluted form, persists today as a measurable component within the genetic makeup of modern North African populations. This detail carries real, if carefully qualified, significance for anyone with roots in the wider region. It means the deep genetic thread connecting 15,000-year-old foragers at Takarkori Cave to 7,000-year-old pastoral herders at Takarkori did not simply end when the desert returned and the population dispersed and gradually mixed with others. It continued, diluted and blended across thousands of subsequent years of population movement and contact, but present, in real and measurable form, within people living across the region today. This finding also carries broader significance for understanding the deep genetic diversity present across the African continent as a whole, diversity that remains, even now, considerably less thoroughly documented through direct ancient DNA evidence than the genetic history of many other world regions. Each successful ancient DNA recovery from a challenging environment like the Sahara meaningfully expands the foundation researchers have available for understanding this deep, still incompletely mapped history. The technical achievement represented by successfully sequencing genomes from remains this old, recovered from an environment this hot, and historically this resistant to genetic preservation, opens a realistic path toward recovering similarly valuable genetic information from other difficult desert sites, both across the wider Sahara and potentially incomparably arid regions elsewhere in the world. There is a specific direct connection worth returning to here between the technical breakthrough and the human story it made possible. Prior to this successful recovery, the deep population history of this specific region of North Africa existed largely as an educated hypothesis built from environmental and archaeological evidence, but lacking the kind of direct genetic confirmation that could definitively distinguish between competing interpretations. The corridor theory and the isolated homeland interpretation were both, before this study, reasonable positions supported by different aspects of the existing indirect evidence. It took the successful recovery of intact genetic material from two specific, unusually well-preserved burials to finally settle which interpretation the direct evidence actually supported. This is worth sitting with as a broader lesson about historical knowledge generally. Entire chapters of human history can remain genuinely uncertain, supported by reasonable but ultimately untested assumptions, until a single piece of well-preserved, carefully analyzed evidence becomes available to test those assumptions directly. The history of the Green Sahara was not unknown before this study. Extensive, carefully documented environmental and archaeological evidence had already established a rich, detailed picture of the region's transformation and the material culture of the people who lived through it. But one central question, arguably the most important question of all, who these people actually were, in terms of deep ancestry and population history, remained genuinely open, dependent on assumption rather than direct evidence, until these two specific burials finally provided a way to test it. The rock art remains on the mountain walls above the former lakeshore, still showing cattle, still showing what researchers interpret as human figures swimming, still showing giraffes and elephants and other animals that could never survive in the desert landscape that exists there today. The pottery fragments, still carrying chemical traces of the milk once processed within them, remain available for continued analysis using techniques that may become even more sophisticated in years to come. The rock shelter itself still stands, offering the same physical shelter from wind and sun that made it a viable, repeatedly occupied settlement for a genetically continuous community across thousands of years. And the genetic data recovered from the two women now exists as a permanent, examinable part of the human genetic record, available not just to the specific research team who first recovered and analyzed it, but to future researchers who will continue comparing it against additional ancient genomes as they become available from other sites across North Africa and the wider continent, gradually building an increasingly detailed, increasingly confident picture of a history that, until very recently, remained almost entirely invisible. This is, in its own way, a meaningful form of continuity, echoing the deeper continuity the genetic evidence itself revealed. A population that persisted, largely unbroken, across tens of thousands of years and multiple dramatic environmental transformations, is now, through the careful, painstaking work of contemporary researchers, becoming part of an active, ongoing scientific conversation, one that will likely continue expanding and refining what is understood about this population and others like it for years to come. The lineage itself may no longer exist in its original undiluted form, but the story of who these people were, where they came from, and how long they remained rooted in this landscape before the desert finally reclaimed it, is, for the first time in 7,000 years, being told with genuine evidence rather than assumption. The two women who made this possible were not seeking recognition. Nothing in the archaeological record suggests they were buried with any expectation that their remains would eventually answer questions their own community could not have imagined anyone asking. They were buried according to the customs of their community, in a shelter that had sheltered their people for thousands of years before them, in a landscape that was, during their own lifetimes, still green, still watered, still capable of sustaining the herding and fishing economy their community had built and adapted across countless preceding generations. What they left behind, entirely without intending to, was the single clearest surviving answer to one of the most significant open questions in North African prehistory. Not who passed through this landscape, but who actually lived here, generation after generation, for longer than almost any other population lineage yet documented anywhere in the archaeological record. There is one final detail worth holding on to, because it says something meaningful about how historical knowledge actually accumulates. This discovery did not come from a dramatic, single moment of excavation, the kind of instantly recognizable find that makes for an easy headline. It came from 2 decades of patient work, the original excavation of the Takarkori shelter in the early 2000s, years of subsequent analysis of its pottery, its rock art, its animal remains, and its broader environmental context, and finally, a technically demanding, initially uncertain attempt to recover genetic material from an environment that had defeated every previous such effort. Each stage depended on the one before it. Without the original archaeologists who carefully excavated and documented all 15 burials, there would have been no remains available for genetic analysis decades later. Without the geneticists who developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for recovering degraded DNA from difficult samples, the two women's well-preserved tissue would have remained scientifically unreadable, exactly as it had for every year before this specific study finally succeeded. Without the population geneticists capable of placing the recovered genetic data into careful, statistically rigorous comparison against dozens of other ancient and modern populations, the raw genetic sequence alone would have revealed little about what it actually meant for understanding this population's deep history. History of this depth is rarely uncovered by any single discovery. It is built, patiently, across years and across disciplines, by researchers willing to keep returning to old questions with new tools, until the evidence finally becomes clear enough to speak for itself. Conclusion. Somewhere beneath the dry stone of the Tadrata Mountains, in a shelter that once looked out over water instead of sand, 2 women were laid to rest by people who loved them, or at least by people who considered their deaths worth marking with care. Nothing in the evidence suggests they were buried as anything other than ordinary members of their community, following customs shared by the many others resting nearby in the same sheltered chamber. No one who buried them could have imagined that 7,000 years later, their bodies would answer a question their entire community and every community that came after them across thousands of subsequent years had no way of asking, let alone answering. Who lived in the Green Sahara? That was the question this investigation set out to answer. And the response the 2 women's genomes ultimately provided was more specific and more surprising than the simple, comfortable assumption that had stood in its place for decades. The Sahara, during its green centuries, was not primarily a highway connecting distant populations across a newly passable continent. For the people who lived at Takarkori, it was something more grounded and, in its own way, more remarkable, a homeland held by a single, deeply continuous population across a span of time reaching back to roughly the same era when other human lineages were beginning the journeys that would eventually carry human ancestry across the entire world. This population did not remain frozen or unchanging. They adapted, repeatedly, across thousands of years and multiple dramatic shifts in their environment. They moved from fishing toward herding. They wove baskets using techniques refined across generations. They processed milk from cattle that had not originated in their own homeland, absorbing new technology and new practices through contact and exchange rather than through displacement by outside populations. They endured droughts that emptied nearby lakes while somehow, through the specific resilience of their own local water sources, continued living in the same sheltered place their ancestors had occupied for millennia before them. And eventually, when the desert's return finally became permanent and irreversible, they dispersed, carrying their ancient, distinct lineage outward into a wider, more genetically connected North Africa, where it gradually blended with other populations across the thousands of years that followed. The strongest responsible answer this evidence supports is this: the corridor theory was not entirely mistaken, but it was, in the case of this specific population, importantly incomplete. Ideas and animals moved across the Green Sahara more freely than people themselves apparently did, at least for the community whose deep ancestry these two women's genomes finally allowed researchers to trace with real confidence. Uncertainty remains, as it should. Other communities living across the vast Green Sahara, at other sites researchers have only begun to study with comparable genetic precision, may well tell different stories, and future discoveries may add nuance, complication, or even correction to the picture this specific investigation has revealed. What will not change, regardless of what future research eventually adds, is the basic fact these two women's preserved bodies made undeniable. An entire, previously undocumented human lineage lived, adapted, and endured across one of the most dramatic environmental transformations any human population has ever experienced, largely apart from populations to their south, even during the very centuries when the landscape should have made that separation hardest to maintain. The rock shelter still stands today, looking out now over the same endless dunes that define the modern Sahara, offering no visible hint of the lakes, the grasslands, or the community that once called this specific stretch of stone and shade a lasting home. The rock art remains on its walls, the cattle, the swimmers, the giraffes, a silent record of a world that has not existed here for 5,000 years. And somewhere within the careful custody of the researchers who finally coaxed a readable genetic story out of two exceptionally preserved bodies, that world's last direct witnesses continue speaking in the only language capable of surviving 7,000 years of Saharan heat, the quiet, patient language written into human bone.